On this slide, we have an example of a method named readFirstLine from a file. So the method receives the path to the file as a string in its input parameter. So the first thing that happens here is that we create a random access file, a reference, and within the try and catch block, we create new random access file specifying that we want to use this path and be able to access this file for reading. So this constructor of the random access file may throw a FileNotFoundException, which is shown here in our exception hierarchy. And if the construction of this object does not fail, the next line is trying to read the first line from the file. However, this may also throw an exception, an input-output exception, which is shown here in our diagram. Right, so this is a superclass of the FileNotFoundException. And here we have an example of two exception handlers with two catch blocks. And as we talked about this earlier, more specific types of exceptions in the exception class hierarchy have to be specified or ordered to appear before more general types of exceptions, such as this input-output exception. So regardless whether an exception was thrown or not, if everything executes normally, then we get to this point where we say return the string containing the first line of the file content. However, although it appears like this return statement is the last statement to be executed in this method, we have the finally block. So before we return from this method, the finally block will execute, and it's also containing the nested try and catch statement, because here we're trying to close the file before exiting from this method readFirstLine, and we check whether the input from random access file is not null, and if so, then we close the file. Otherwise, we are catching the generic exception and printing that we're unable to close the file. So this is an example of a sequence of workflow in method like this, where number one, we start executing some statements, we enter the try block. Optionally, we may execute the catch blocks if any exceptions are thrown, and notice that all these return statements will be preceded by the execution of the finally block, which does its own work with closing the file. And so each of these return statements will be the final step in the execution of this method.